Public awareness of hazards associated with patent medicines heightened due to Sinclair's book The Jungle, as well as due to relentless efforts of muckrakers. Their main concerns were adulteration of food, preservatives used in meat, and opium addiction caused by patent medicines. The first Pure Food and Drug Act was composed by U.S. Pharmacopeia Chairman James Beall. President Theodore Roosevelt signed it into law in 1906. The purpose of the act was to protect the public from the medicines for which there was no scientific support. The act also created the Food and Drug Administration, which was entrusted with the responsibility for testing all foods and drugs for human consumption. Certain drugs were no longer available for patients to buy without physician's prescription. Addiction-forming drugs, such as opium, had to display this information on the label. President Theodore Roosevelt became personally involved in advocating the new act, against resistance from manufacturers and distributors. However, the most influential advocate of the new act was Harvey Wiley, head of the Bureau of Chemistry of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. His Poison Squad tested food preservatives. His lobbying eventually helped to win support in the Congress. The United States Pharmacopeia, USP, was recognized as the official standard for strength, quality, and purity of drugs, along with the National Formulary. Drugs recognized in these compendia now were legally required to meet their standards. Sulfanilamide was a highly effective antimicrobial drug, game changer in the treatment of wounds on the battlefields of World War II. It was the first drug which cured bacterial infections. Elixir sulfanilamide was a popular version of this drug produced by S.E. Massengill Company, a company from Tennessee. When mixed with water, sulfanilamide forms suspension and does not dissolve. Liquid form was in demand to treat children's sore throat. The company chief chemist and pharmacist, Harold Cole Watkins, dissolved the drug in diethylene glycol, commonly used solvent, now used as antifreeze. Its toxicity was known at that time already. There were reports and even studies of its renal toxicity in scientific literature. None of these studies reached Massengill. The laboratory tests they performed showed satisfactory flavor, appearance, and fragrance. No toxicity tests were required at that time, so the new variation of the elixir was dispatched to customers right away, without any approval. Raspberry-flavored elixir sulfanilamide poisoned and killed 107 people. 34 of them were children. This is what Dr. Calhoun wrote in his letter from October 1937. But to realize that 6 human beings, all of them my patients, one of them my best friend, are dead because they took medicine that I prescribed for them innocently, and to realize that that medicine which I had used for years in such cases suddenly had become a deadly poison in its newest and most modern form, as recommended by a great and reputable pharmaceutical firm in Tennessee. Well, that realization has given me such days and nights of mental and spiritual agony as I did not believe a human being could undergo and survive. I have known hours when death for me would be a welcome relief from this agony. FDA sent all its 239 inspectors to track down the company's 200 salesmen and recover all 633 shipments of the toxic drug. Newspapers and radio stations continued to issue warnings to the public. Ingenious investigative approach was needed to find patients who purchased the drug from pharmacies all over the United States. Many pharmacists had no records of prescriptions or sale. The incident hastened enactment of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. The act had no impact on distribution practices, however. Regulations affecting distribution were introduced much later, as pharmaceutical enterprises grew bigger and consolidated into international powerhouses of today. The new Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act required drug manufacturers to prove that new drugs were safe before placing them on the market. The FDA was also entrusted with the authority to regulate cosmetics and medical devices. The origin of the law is an intriguing story in itself. Judge David F. Cavers published a very interesting record of the campaign and added his perspective as well. The full article can be found in course materials. It is a fascinating read. In 1933, New York Senator Royal S. Copeland introduced the Tugwell Bill to protect the consumers from unscrupulous practices of some food and drug manufacturers. Rexford G. Tugwell, then Assistant Secretary of Agriculture, initiated revision of the Act of 1906. It is striking that the public was almost unaware of this important act, which affected the life and health of every citizen. As Judge Cavers pointed out, the consumer interest is difficult to organize for its own protection. Back in 1906, the media vigorously supported the new Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. But this was not the case after 1933. Manufacturers, retailers, and the nation's press formed strong opposition against the bill. The nation's press remained silent on the issue, most likely because the measure was largely seen as a menace to revenues from advertising. In 1906, Sinclair's book The Jungle helped mobilize support for the first food and drug bill by describing practices in the meat industry in vivid detail. The awareness of limited protections of consumers increased substantially after the publication of Your Money's Worth by Stuart Chase and Fred Schlenk in 1927, and 100 Million Guinea Pigs by Callett and Schlenk in 1933. The 1906 Act had already been revised 5 times. One of the revisions, the 1912 Shirley Amendment, was necessitated by 1911 Supreme Court decision in U.S. v. Johnson. The court held that the original misbranding provisions of the Act did not cover therapeutic claims. FDA officials and members of the Solicitor's Office of the Department of Agriculture began drafting the Act in March 1933. It soon became obvious that mere amendment to the existing law won't be enough, and that a completely new Act is needed. Industry feedback on the new Act was sought by the conferences did not provide any suggestions of value. The FDA lobbied for the new law by assembling an array of pictures, labels, and advertisements of ineffective, harmful, and occasionally lethal nostrums, cosmetic preparations, and adulterated or deceptively packaged foodstuffs. The exhibit was soon nicknamed the American Chamber of Horrors. Efforts to regulate advertising claims were not taken well by the drug industry. One complaint stated that the new bill is a calculated attempt to deprive the American public of its right to self-medication. Astonishingly, the American Medical Association remained silent overall. Senator Copeland, sponsor of the bill, was under constant pressure from various special interest groups. His attempts to conciliate opposition did not result in much desired compromise, but in the introduction of a competing bill by the industry, the so-called McCarran-Jenks bill. The bill was reintroduced to Congress several times with numerous amendments every time. Extensive debate concerned the FDA power to make multiple seizures of adulterated drugs, added the definition of adulteration and misbranding, and clarified the division of jurisdiction between the Federal Trade Commission and the FDA. In 1936, the Tugwell Bill lost in the 74th Congress, 70 to 190. Senator Copeland reintroduced the bill in January 1937.